Russia is living through a long historical period where it has nobody but itself to rely on. These were the words of Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov at the education marathon that happened this past week. This is what Lavrov said, and I quote, "As we can see, the West's reaction to the implementation of the special military operation in Ukraine clearly shows that from the very outset, the aim was to weaken and, as some political scientists in the West admit, to dismember our country. During the era we are now living through, and it is precisely an era, a long historical period, we have to be prepared to realize that we have nobody but ourselves to rely on." Unquote. It's becoming apparent that Russia, which once used to be a great countervailing force to the United States, is left with very few friends in the international community, both in Europe as well as in Central Asia. On Crux Decode, why is Russia running out of friends? Has the war ended up isolating Russia in a way we didn't even see during the height of the Cold War? And what will it take for Russia to find friends and allies again, both in Europe as well as in Central Asia? Sergey Lavrov sought to justify this isolation by saying that Russia was well aware of the inability of the West to negotiate and honor commitments. Remember the famous promise that was made to the late Mikhail Gorbachev at the fall of the Soviet Union, that NATO will not expand eastwards. NATO had also committed to the indivisible security both of Europe and of Russia. Lavrov stressed that all those commitments have now been thrown into the dustbin. Russia, on the other hand, is seeking to advance its agenda, which is based on the principles of the UN Charter, as well as respect the sovereign equality of all states. Now, this could very well be seen as bluster, seeing just how much Russia has been isolated since the start of this war. And nowhere is it more apparent than in Europe. Before the war, countries like Germany, Italy, and Poland were swing states who didn't mind doing business with Putin as long as their interests were taken care of. They were unlike France or the UK, which were more inclined to America's way of thinking and forever suspicious of Russia and its intentions. Now, after the war, with one fell swoop, Putin has managed to push all of Europe into America's ambit, thereby making it extremely suspicious of Russia and its actions. Not just that, more and more European countries are embracing the NATO fold. You've seen recently how Finland and Sweden have formally applied for entry into the 30-member military club. If Putin's intention was to split Europe, he has managed to do just the opposite of that. The Ukraine crisis has changed international, regional, and of course territorial equations and balances. And it's not just in Europe, it's also Central Asia, where Washington is now looking at the Central Asian republics to be able to further tighten the noose on Russia. Russia has been looking at the CAR countries to circumvent the sanctions that the West has imposed. Now, recently we had some high-profile American officials visiting the capitals of Central Asia and offering both security and military cooperation as well as economic assistance. What the United States is attempting to do is to strike a double blow, not just to Moscow, but also to Beijing. America's stated goal in Central Asia will be to combat terrorism and the danger that emanates particularly from Afghanistan. However, among its lines is also an attempt to try and distance Russia from what was considered Russia's backyard up until recently. Now, this means that Russia will have twin headaches, not just from its northern borders, remember with Finland and of course further west to Sweden, because they are now formally embracing the NATO fold, but also its southern borders with the Central Asian republics. Central Asia is increasingly becoming an arena for competition between Russia, the United States, and of course China. The elites in the Central Asian countries have interpreted their independence with the collapse of the Soviet Union as independence from Moscow. Now, that made them turn early on to other centers of power, notably Washington, Beijing, and in part Ankara. However, they turn to Russia during extreme situations. We just saw that at the start of this year with Kazakhstan. We've also seen that with Tajikistan during the 1990s in the bloody civil war that consumed that country. Now, some believe that Russia, by backing long-time despots and dictators in these countries, is actually helping them play Washington against Moscow. Many consider this as short-sightedness of Russian foreign policy. It is akin to Russia playing footsie with Mexico and Canada in a bid to weaken the United States in its near neighborhood. The former Soviet states were accustomed, they considered it natural for Russia to offer them political assistance and economic preference. They also found participation in structures that were established by Russia, whether it's the Eurasian Economic Union or the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And this was most evident recently when the Kazakh president Kassym-Jomart Tokayev and the way he behaved in his visit to Russia recently. It was seen through his statement about his country's commitment to the policy of anti-Moscow sanctions, which of course officially would put Kazakhstan in the position of an unfriendly country towards Russia. Tokayev's comments comes just a few months after he had personally requested security assistance from the CSTO led by Russia, who readily committed to sending troops to his country, even as the protests spread to Almaty, the largest city in Kazakhstan. And just a few months after calm was restored in Kazakhstan, after the entry of peacekeepers from the CSTO, Tokayev went on to publicly diss Russia. He went on to say, and that too in the presence of Vladimir Putin, that his country does not recognize the Donetsk and the Luhansk People's Republics, something that was the starting point of this war in Ukraine. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia is entirely isolated. Even today, more than 80% of countries around the world have not joined Washington and NATO-led sanctions against Russia in the United Nations. In fact, large countries like China, India, even Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Iran have been very careful in walking a fine line between Washington and Moscow. But where Russia finds itself most isolated is in its near abroad, from Western Europe to Central Asia. And that may take years to restore back to its pre-war levels.